We're going to start with a hymn. The hymn will be I'd Rather Have Jesus. It's Silver Gold. The good old Billy Graham hymn. Very, very, very pleasant to us, isn't it? We'd rather have Jesus than anything. So, if you can all rise and we'll start singing. Yes. We're going to wait for the keyboard to wake up. Yep.
And when neither sun nor stars and many days appear, and no small tempest lay on us, all hope that we should be saved was then taken away. We trust the Lord to bless the reading of His precious word. For over 2 years, Paul had been imprisoned unjustly. First by the Jews and then by the Romans. He hasn't done anything to deserve that. He didn't break any laws. And yet he received no justice. And so Paul resorted to the last thing he could do. No justice from the Jews, no justice from the Romans. He appealed to Caesar. And because he appealed to Caesar, Paul had to be taken by boat to Rome, in Italy, to appear and to be judged by Caesar. And on this voyage, Acts chapter 27, they encountered a mighty storm. And that's the background and the context of this storm, and which we see Paul in the storm. Now, for those who have joined us after the session, after the first session, last session we've looked at Jonah, the prophet in the storm. And we have highlighted 4 things. 4 things that highlight Jonah's life, ours as well. You can either run from God, as Jonah's done. You can run to God in prayer. You can run with God, working with God, serving God, looking up to God, and so on. Or you can run ahead of God. Jonah ran from God, and we saw the consequences of that decision. Acts chapter 27, it's not now the prophet in the storm, it is Paul in the storm. And you will notice Paul was running with God. Makes all the difference. Paul ran with God. I divided the chapter into 3 sections. In verses 1 to 20, we have the recurring of problems. The recurring of problems. Verse 21 to 26, the reaction of Paul to those problems, to the storm. And then verse 27 to 44, the reaction of the people on the ship, the mariners, the sailors. How did they react to the storm? So the recurring of the problems, the reaction of Paul, and finally the reaction of the people. Verses 1 to 20, the recurring of problems. Acts chapter 27 gives us the impression that this storm would never end. It was just ongoing. Wind after wind affected their decisions. It affected their choices. It affected their lives. It affected their livelihood. Wind after wind. Have you noticed how often winds are mentioned in this section? Verse 4. The second part of verse 4 says, the winds were contrary. Contrary. It was against them. I call it disturbing winds. Disturbing winds. They were against them. In verse 7, the wind was challenging. and didn't allow them in the direction they wanted to go. It says, the wind not suffering us, not permitting us. I call it deliberate winds. Deliberate winds. In verse 13, in addition to the winds that were contrary and the winds that were challenging, in verse 13 we find there were also calm winds, peaceful winds, as it were. It says the south wind blew softly, but I call that deceiving winds. Deceiving winds. And lastly, verse 14, the second part, we read, there arose against it a tempestuous wind called the European. This wind was far from calm. It was catastrophic. It wasn't deliberate, it wasn't deceiving, it was devastating. Winds recurring in this chapter. So it seems like the winds were coming and coming and coming, one right after the other, never stopped. Never stopped. They were recurring. Isn't that exactly what you and I experience in life? You just got over one storm and you run right into the next storm. If it's not family, it's business. If it's not business, it's work. If it's not work, it's school. And it goes on and on and on. The recurring of problems. In Jonah's case, we've noticed that the wind was singular. It was God's wind. The wind that God has sent. But a wind that Jonah brought upon himself. But these winds, these were not winds of God. These were winds of nature that God allowed in the life of Paul. And although Paul had done nothing to deserve this, he was never exempted from the winds, from the storm. And you might ask, well, what have I done wrong? When you go through a difficult time, when something happens that you don't like, you ask yourself, and that's a natural question, what have I done wrong? That's a wrong question, brother. Wrong question, sister. The question we should ask is, what can I learn from this? What is God trying to tell me? What is God teaching me? Storms were a recurring feature in the life of Paul. If you go to 2 Corinthians chapter 11, verse 25, listen to what Paul says. He says other things, but I've just highlighted the things with regards to storms. He says, thrice I suffered shipwreck. This is not the first time. Thrice. He says, a night and a day I have been in the deep. That means adrift at sea. He says in verse 26, he was in perils of water. He was in perils in the sea. The wind, the recurring wind, is a feature in this chapter. It was a feature in Paul's life. And we are featured in our lives as well. We are not better than Paul. But right in the middle of this ferocious storm, rather than running from God or running ahead of God, Paul was running with God. He was running with God. He says in verse 25, I believe God. Could you say that in a ferocious storm? When your life is in danger? When there are 276 people that's about to die, to perish. This man stood up and said, I believe God. Oh, Paul, look at the storm. Look at the ship. Look at everything that we've lost. We throw the cargo overseas. We throw the tackling overseas. We hang on to the wheat. That's our livelihood. I believe God. Because Paul was running with God. You see, when Paul was found running with God, it changed him. It transformed him. It transported him. And storms will have the same effect on you and me. Because storms move ships. No ship can remain stationary during a storm. Storms move ships. And by the end of the storm, the ship will be found in a different place. We'll see in a minute. How this storm or this ship got to a point where they couldn't do anything any longer. And when this Euroclydon came, that devastating and catastrophic wind, they couldn't bear up in the wind. They just let it go. They lost control. They just let it sail, let the wind take over. But they ended up with God wanted them to end it. This storm brought Paul to a new place. It moved him physically, but it also transformed him spiritually. Because in the end, you see that Paul, the prisoner, at the end is now Paul the commander. Paul the prisoner is taking charge and everybody's listening to Paul. Oh, he's been moved physically as well as spiritually. Unlike Jonah, Paul had now influence and Paul had authority. Are you in a storm? I can assure you, when your storm is over, you will be in a different place. And you can thank God for that. You will be transformed. You will be transported. You will be in a much better place, in a much better position to help others, to encourage others, to support others. If you've been through a few storms. One day, about 15 years ago, I visited a young sister in the hospital who was diagnosed with cancer. And I just felt I had nothing to say to her. I didn't know what she was going through. And I walked away, felt like a failure. And I said to the Lord, Lord, if only I had cancer, I would know what to say to this. I can sympathize and empathize with this girl. A month after, I was diagnosed with cancer. Be careful what you wish for. But the point is, that storm moved me. And I was able afterwards, even in the hospital or long afterwards, to help others, to support others. Because I've been through a storm. The storm moved me. And so storms of life, as you know already, are recurring, as you've seen in this section. In verse 8, they arrived at the place called Fair Havens. Fair Havens. Despite the lovely name, Beautiful Havens, it was not an ideal place to spend the winter. It was inconvenient, it was unsuitable. But Paul advised the centurion and the master and the captain and the owner, he said, it is still your best option. Still your best option than being out in the sea in the winter. Of course, who's Paul? The tent maker. Who would listen to Paul? So they remained at Fair Havens for a wee while. But then after a while, they were fooled. Because another wind came up in verse 13. Calm winds, deceiving winds, warm winds. Verse 13, it says, the south wind blew softly. And against Paul's advice, they decided to sail further west to Phoenice. Or the name also today is Phoenix, which was a far better port and a far safer port. Now it seemed like a reasonable decision, but they never reached Phoenix. When I was younger, I remember as a teenager there was a song that was played on the radio, and I think the tune or the title was "By the Time You Get to Phoenix." Some of the oldest might know it. I don't know why I know this, because we were not allowed to listen to the radio. But there's the song, by the time you get to Phoenix. They never got to Phoenix. They never got to Phoenix to do what they wanted to do. They made the wrong decision, and it led to what this chapter is all about. The storm on the sea. Now, as they sailed on, with a soft wind blowing behind them, all of a sudden, they encountered a different kind of wind. Not calm winds, but in verse 14, catastrophic winds. Verse 14b, there arose against it a tempestuous wind called Euroclydon. This was a violent agitation of the sea. This was a wind raising mighty waves. This tempestuous wind was basically what we call today a typhoon. That's what you don't want to be called in a typhoon, especially not in the Mediterranean. But I want you to notice, this is the only wind in the chapter that has a name. It has a name. I'm sure, if asked, you'd be able to name your storms. There are storms you just can't forget. They're too ferocious, destructive. Storms in the family, at work, in the business, in the assembly. Oh, you can name a number of storms. You have your own Euroclydons. In verse 15, when the ship was caught, we could not bear up in the wind. This is this wind, this catastrophic wind. And we let her drive. We let it go. We lost control. We're giving up. It was against them. It was in their face. They lost control, like I said, and so they let it go. And life is sometimes just like that. When things get rough, we no longer have much control, if any control, over things. And we are simply being driven by whatever is happening, driven by the storm, losing control. Things quickly get out of control. And so there they were in the Mediterranean Sea, driven by a wind, driven by a tempestuous wind. They couldn't control where we're going. You know, there's one who never lost control. God. And you know, God took that ship, God controlled that ship to where they were supposed to be. It reminds me of the storm on the Sea of Galilee with the Lord Jesus Christ and his disciples. The Lord said to him, let's go to the other side. I think there was a mighty storm. He stood up and he calmed the storm, and immediately they were where they were supposed to be, on the other side. So when you're running with God, and when you make a habit of running to God, no matter the severity of the storm, him being the Lord of the storm, the Lord of the sea, he will direct, he will guide you every step until he gets you safely home. Sorry. He did it for the disciples. He did it for Paul. He can do it for you, but the question is, are you running with God? Are you running with God? Surely, running with God, as Paul did, will score some divine brownie points, won't it? There must be some divine recognition of what you are doing for God. So why isn't there immediate relief in our storms? Why is the storm ongoing? Why doesn't it stop? Are we sometimes trying to bargain with God to get us through the storm as quickly as possible? And we'll say to God, I will do this. Just get me out of the storm. I will stop doing that. Just get me out of the storm. God doesn't always work like that. Sometimes before things get better, they actually get worse. As God will accomplish his divine purposes through that storm in your life. And we see the same thing here. In verse 18, they started to lighten the ship by throwing the cargo overboard. And you'd say, well, there must be improvement. We got rid of some stuff. But actually the next day, it got worse, verse 19. And the third day we cast up with our own hands the clean of the ship. Surely, the ship is like the down. We shouldn't have much of a problem until you come to verse 20. And when neither sun nor stars in many days appeared, think of the darkness. No sun, no moon, no stars. And as things cannot get any worse, they lost their means of navigation. That's the only way they could navigate their way through the sea. But they couldn't see the sea, the sun, and the stars. Imagine, you find yourself in a new town, in a new city, in a new country, and you have to navigate the roads without your GPS, without your TomTom, without your Google Maps. You'll give up before you even start. This was a difficult situation. This was a desperate situation. So that after 14 days, all seemed lost. Verse 20, the second part of verse 20, all hope that we should be saved was taken away. No hope. Hopeless. Helpless. I believe this happens to us all of the time. One moment, the south wind is blowing south up, warmly and softly in our life. And we feel safe in beautiful havens, fair havens. And the next, you're hit by a ferocious storm called the Euroclydon. Does that sound familiar? I'm sure there are some who have been in a storm recently. I'm sure there are some who are in a storm right at this moment. Maybe you've been diagnosed with something. Maybe you lost your job. Maybe there was a phone call to the doctor. Anything. You might be going through a difficult time. You will agree with me. Storms are recurring. But you know, God will eventually bring you through. Just trust Him for the right time. Not for your time. You want to learn what God is trying to teach you through the storm. Otherwise, what's the point of the storm? What's the use of you going through the storm? You want to learn as much from that storm as you can. But I can assure you, it will eventually subside. We read in Psalms, weeping may endure for a lifetime, but joy comes from the Lord. It's always joy. One day, it was starting raining heavily. And the little boy asked his dad, he says, Dad, do you think it will stop? Dad says, it always has. Always has. You in the storm? You wonder how long it will go? You wonder about the intensity and severity and the length of the storm. It's always ended. In the past. For you. For me. The recurring of problems. Secondly, the reaction of Paul in verse 21 to 26. We've already seen in verse 20, all hope that we should be saved, they say, was then taken away. But that was the attitude of the sailors. Paul came to a different conclusion. Listen to what he says. Verse 22. And now I exhort you to be of good cheer. Good cheer, Paul? What are you talking about? Be of good cheer, because there shall be no loss of any man's life among you, but only of the ship. What was Paul's response to the storm, to the winds, to the danger? Something that should mark all of us. Faith in God. Faith in God. Here we find in verse 21, Paul stood for his faith. He stood in his faith. We read in verse 21, Paul stood forth in the midst of them. You remember Jonah failed to stand. His faith let him down. His faith failed him. And instead of getting up, he went down in a number of ways. Paul stood up. Paul stood up to remind him of the warning that he's given them a few days ago. But it wasn't that I told you so. It was to stress, to highlight the wisdom of his advice. Jonah's lack of faith brought hopelessness to those around him. Paul's faith in God brought tremendous hope and encouragement to those around him. He says in verse 22 again, for there shall be no loss of any man's life among you. Paul stood in his faith. But when you come to chapter verse 22, you see Paul shared his faith. Not only did he stand in his faith, now he shares his faith from verse 23 onwards. Paul was looking at the circumstances, and he used the circumstances not to feel sorry for himself, not to try to get out of the situation, not to blame others for not listening to him in the first place. No, he used the circumstances to share his faith. The men in Jonah confronted him about who he was, what he was doing, what he believed. I would not need to ask Paul. He wasn't waiting on them to ask him. He was blurting it out. He was sharing his faith. He says in verse 23, for there stood by me this night the angel of the Lord of God, whose I am and whom I serve. More than just sharing his faith, he also shared the words of an angel in verse 24. And the angel said, fear not, Paul, thou must be brought before Caesar, and lo, God hath given thee all them that sail with thee. These are tremendous words. These are tremendous promises. These others that have said, but we're in the middle of the storm. We've lost control. We've been hit by the Riocadan. And you say you're going to Caesar? You're going to make it to Rome? Yes, says Paul, I believe God. Because he was running with God. And he knew, doesn't matter, despite what's going to happen, he will end up in Rome. But in addition to that, he says none of you will lose your lives. 276, you think at least there must be one or two deaths. Not a single one, because God promised him every single soul. You see, that means the fact that the angel says God granted you means that he's prayed for him. That's something that he's prayed for. And God heard his prayer and granted him his prayer. Jonah, on the other hand, in order for others to survive, he had to be thrown overboard, not Paul. Paul was guaranteed not only his own life, but also the life of the other saints. We asked the question, how did Jonah end up in the storm? He ran from God. How did Paul end up in the storm? He ran with God. So it doesn't matter whether you're doing good or bad. If you're a believer, storms will be part of your Christian journey. So what was Jonah? This is the difference. What did Jonah do in the storm? Jonah slept. What did Paul do in the storm? Paul prayed. Paul prayed. It's probably the last thing we want to do when we're in the middle of a storm. We don't have time for prayer. Oh, I'm going to organize this, and I'm going to have a meeting with this and with that person and so on, and I need to get some support. I don't have time to pray. Our brother Ian emphasized the importance of regular daily prayer. And in verse 24, God gave him a message of comfort as he prayed. You remember the Lord Jesus Christ was transfigured. Luke tells us what he was doing. Luke tells us he prayed. And as he prayed, he was transfigured. God promised safety, a full safety to all on board in response to Paul's prayer on their behalf. Because God said, you must stand before Caesar. And then no matter the severity of the storm and the greatness of the storm, God's promises can never be thwarted, can never be cancelled. Nothing can stand in the way of God's promises and purposes. You see, God didn't take him out of the storm as we'd expect. The danger was just as great to Paul as it was to the saints. The waves were just as high and the darkness just as intense. So what's the difference? But in the midst of it, God strengthened him. God comforted him. God helped him. And God gave him an inward reassurance that enabled Paul to stand and to be different to those around him. Do you know that we have divine resources that others know nothing about? It will make it possible for us to be different, to act different, to react differently from those around us. If we, like Paul, run with God. Run with God. Please note that the Lord took care of Paul without stopping the storm. He could easily have done it. He's done it before. He's calmed 2 storms on the Sea of Galilee. In fact, he's done it for Jonah. God intervened and he calmed the storm in Jonah chapter 1. In this case, God let the storm play out its full course, its full intensity. In his sovereign will, he allowed the storm in Paul's life, the fullness of the storm. But in the process, like I said, he offered strength and guidance and encouragement. Now, God does save us from the storm from time to time, doesn't he? But most of the time, he keeps us and he saves us in the storm. You remember Daniel's 3 friends? They were not taken, they were not saved from the fire. They were saved in the fire. Remember in Acts, Peter was delivered. But James was killed within 2 days. How do we make sense of that? If not Peter, if not James, why Peter? If not Peter, why James? Is God unfair? I'll take you to a few verses in Hebrews chapter 11, where we read about the heroes of faith. Some enjoy deliverance. Others mark them with just out of this world. Hebrews chapter 11, verse 33. The writer spoke of those who stopped the mouths of lions, victorious, quenched the violence of the fire, escaped the edge of the sword, out of weakness were made strong. In verse 35, women received the dead, raised to life again, but others were tortured. Verse 36. Others had trial of cruel mockings and scourgings, of bonds and imprisonments. They were stoned. They were sawn asunder. They were tempted and slain with the sword. They were destitute and afflicted and tormented. God, in his sovereignty and his divine wisdom, he knows exactly what to allow, when to allow things, and who to allow to go through the storm. We don't understand that. But I'm sure these men of faith, heroes of faith, they're in heaven now. And they say, we don't want anyone to go through the experiences, but we don't want to be without those experiences. We got to know the Lord in a better way. And we've got martyrdom to thank. Sometimes he saves from the storm, but many times he will let the storm rage on in our lives until he has accomplished all the purposes and the designs for the storm. Paul was all about faith in God. All about faith in God. It was central to his theology, but it was also central to his life. because he ran to God. The recurring of problems, the reaction of Paul, and very briefly, the reaction of the people, verse 27 to 44. In the third section, Paul's faith is seen as a teaching tool to others, but to us as well. The sailors were overcome with fear. That's how they reacted. In fearing the worst, in verse 29, they lowered 4 anchors at the back. Not only did they lower the anchors at the back, but under the pretense of lowering the anchors in the front, they tried to escape via the lifeboat. The soldiers were informed and they cut the ropes. No lifeboats. Think about that. Ferocious storms, there's not even a lifeboat available. Their fear turned to flight. In a word, they all panicked. So the question is, what gave Paul such tremendous courage and peace in this tremendous storm? I'll tell you why. Paul's anchor was not below. Paul's anchor was above. We have an anchor that keeps the soul. They lost the lifeboat, their only means of escape. Paul's lifeboat was not attached to the ship. Paul's lifeboat was far away from it, far removed from it. It was in heaven. It was his faith in God, and therefore it was unaffected by the storm. What do you depend on in the storm? In verse 38, we read that when they had eaten enough, they lightened the ship and cast out the wheat and the grain into the sea. If you notice, this is the last things that they threw out. Because they were precious. This was their business. This was their money. This was their livelihood. They were trying to hang on to that as long as they could. But now, in the face of death, in light of eternity, they realize how trivial, irrelevant, and unimportant stuff was. Don't we love to hang on to stuff? We think of stuff as the things that we cherish, our possessions, our achievements, our positions, our status, and so on. But sometimes circumstances will bring us to a point, storms will bring us to a point where we realize that those things, the stuff, insignificant in view of the value of life. This storm posed 2 questions, very important questions in relation to suffering. 2 questions. The first question is, why is there suffering in the world? Why is there suffering in the world? Well, why is there suffering in the first place? Because skeptics ask, where's God? If there's a God, why does he allow that? Why doesn't he do something about it? Isn't he a loving God? There are at least 2, I'm sure there's more, but there's at least 2 historical events that explain the existence of suffering in the world. The first is creation. God created this world, and he set up this world with natural laws for the good of men. But if those laws are violated and abused, the natural outcome will be suffering. There will be consequences. So the question is, who's really behind suffering? Not God. Then there's the fall, a second historical event. Some people ask, why didn't God create a world that was perfect and free from natural disasters? I tell you, he did. Eden was a place of tranquility. It was paradise of beauty. No sickness, no diseases, no sin, no nothing. Until man sinned and brought sin into this world. Paul reminds us in Romans chapter 5, with no access to the tree of life, death passed upon all men. When Adam and Eve sinned, They introduce physical death, but they also introduce spiritual death. Death and suffering entered the vocabulary of mankind because Adam decided to disobey God. So who's behind suffering? There's a reason for suffering in this world. And that reason is man. Man. But now for the second question. And it's a more pointed question. We can understand, in view of that, why there's suffering in the world. But why does God allow suffering in the lives of His own? Why do believers have to suffer? Well, a Christian martyr had been asked, what is the weakness among modern day Christians? And his answer was, they have an inadequate view of suffering. An inadequate view of suffering, that's true of believers anywhere and everywhere. You see, it's not always God's will for believers, for everyone to be healthy and wealthy. But instead of submitting to God, we complain, we grow bitter when we experience sorrow and storms. We ask, why? Why me? Why now? Don't I have a right to happiness? Where was God when I needed Him, whenever it was? The problem with those kind of questions is they all share in common an inadequate view of suffering. So why does God allow His people to suffer? Well, the real question is, what do we understand about suffering? What do we know about suffering? It's of paramount importance that we understand suffering from God's perspective, from heaven's perspective. And if we do that, it will change everything. My view, my perspective of suffering. Paul tells us in Philippians chapter 1 and 29, he says, suffering is a gift. I'm not going to read it because I don't have the time. Suffering is a gift. Can you get your head around that? James adds to that, he says, suffering is a joy. And then Peter, he says something even more important. He says in 1 Peter 2 and 19, and the ESV states it beautifully. And reads, he speaks of suffering. For this is a gracious thing, a thankworthy thing, when mindful of God, one endures sorrows while suffering unjustly. Wow. If we could see suffering as a gift and a joy and a thankworthy thing, it will change things. Suffering is a reality for both the believer and the unbeliever. But in the midst of suffering, the believer can trust God, put his faith in God. And you know, when that happens, we see that in the life of Paul, in the storm. When Paul put his faith on God, it elevated him above the storm. It submerged him below the storm. To illustrate that, an eagle knows when a storm is approaching long before it hits. And when he perceives that, the eagle will fly to the highest point. And when the winds come, it spreads its wings, and the wind will lift him higher and higher while the storm is raging below. So it doesn't escape the storm. Still part of the storm. But it simply uses the storm to lift it, to elevate it higher. It rises on the same wings that brings devastation into his world. What a life. What a lesson. Yes, I agree with you and you agree with me. There are some storms that bring devastation into our lives. But it's a very storms that God can use to elevate you. Not only will it elevate you above the storms, but it might submerge you below the storm. A submarine being tested had to be submerged for a few days. And once it returned to the surface, somebody asked the captain, how were you affected by the storm last night? He said, storm? What storm? You see, the submarine went down to a depth where the waters are never stirred or disturbed by whatever happens on the surface. How do we reach such deep spiritually? Absolute faith in God. It is the only way to reach the depth needed to find true calm in the storm. By way to close. Take it back to Jonah. Jonah in chapter 1, you remember, ran from God. In chapter 2, he ran to God. In chapter 3, he ran with God. In chapter 4, he ran from God. But in the storm, it was different. In the storm of chapter 1, Jonah continued to run from God. Jonah never ran to God. Jonah never ran with God. In fact, in every aspect, he ran ahead of God. How different to Paul. Paul in the storm, he ran to God. He prayed, not only for himself, but for the sailors. Paul in the storm, he ran to God because he preached, and he witnessed, and he believed, and he followed God's word. He was never ahead of God. So let me close by asking you the same question. Where are you in your Christian journey? Running from God? Running to God? Running with God, which is ideal, or are you running ahead of God? Let me close with one verse in the chorus of a gospel song written about 50 years ago. It says, "In the dark of the midnight have I oft hid my face, while the storm howls above me, and there's no hiding place. With the crash of the thunder, precious Lord, hear my cry, keep me safe till the storm passes by." The chorus. Till the storm passes over. And the thunder no more. Till the clouds roll forever from the sky. Hold me fast, let me stand in the hollow of thy hand. Keep me safe till the storm passes by. Well, this is
Thank you, Marius. He's right, isn't it? All of us have been through storms at some stage in your life. While you were speaking, Marius, I was thinking of the verse that the Lord helped me with one of my schools, found in Psalm 31, verse 14, the first part of verse. I trust with our right times in what hands we are in, nails scarred, they love us. And that got me through a storm, Marius. My times were those things like I had peace with them. Real peace. Right, just some notices. I know there are some that are leaving up this service, and we just want to thank you for coming. We will pray that you are given due mercies as you travel home. It's been wonderful to have fellowship with you. And we've really had some wonderful spiritual food. Also, I'd like to give thanks for the missions leading us in the scene. Also, many thanks for those that have fed us out the back. All those sisters that have been working up there, and all those ones who have brought food. We have certainly enjoyed the ladies, haven't we? So we just want to give a big shout out to them and really appreciate what they've done for us. We're gonna, after we've had a hymn and a prayer, closing prayer, there will be a break for refreshments, and after that, there will be a youth activity. And as I look out on the audience here, I see they're all youth, because it is for you as well. And well, we all feel about 20, don't we? It's just the body doesn't respond. You got something to say there, Simeon? Yep, Simeon's got something to say. Change it back to normal. Yeah. So you are welcome to stay. Ross Pearson's going to give a message, and it will be for young and old. So we'll break for refreshments after a prayer, and we're going to have a hymn, an item given by the youth group. So I'm looking forward to that. It's a wonderful hymn that they're going to be singing. I don't know about tomorrow. And that really follows in from Marius's message. I want to thank the speakers for being open to God's leading in the messages they've given to us. And especially for Ian, who changed that message. And I believe that was a direct guidance from God. Because the messages that God led you to give all of you speakers is what we need to hear today. So I'll just close in prayer, and then the youth group will come and give an item and song to you. Our gracious God and Father in heaven, we acknowledge that you are God and God alone. You have no equal. And it's to you that we can come and put our faith and our trust through the good times and through the bad times. For Lord, you are our God. Our times are in your hands, and are the hands of love. And Father, we're never alone. Lord, I think of that home regards the footprints in the sand. And when we look back, we see one set of footprints. And that's when you were carrying us. And Lord, we just want to come and say we love you and thank you for your goodness to us. And Father, we just pray now that those ones who are leaving us at the stage to go back home will grant unto them your mercies. We have enjoyed their fellowship. Oh Lord, what a time it's going to be in heaven around your throne. This is just a taste. And Lord, we just pray that you would just bless us through the rendering of this item by the young people. May we listen to their words and be encouraged through them. Lord Jesus, we come and ask that you would just once again bless us as we ask these things to be you the glory. Amen. I'll hand over to Simeon.
Some of the youth were not able to get here today, and we thought we'll cancel the item. But after what Marius has shared with us, we thought it'd be